All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Antiwar Radio. I'm Scott Horton. Appreciate y'all tuning in. Our next guest on the show today is Josh Ruebner. He is the National Advocacy Director of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, a national coalition of more than 325 organizations working to change U.S. policy toward Israel-Palestine to support human rights, international law, and equality. And their website is endtheoccupation.org, and you can also find, it looks like 2 or 3 pieces here by Josh at the Huffington Post. That's huffingtonpost.com/Josh Ruebner, Ruebner, and there's a dash between his 2 names there. But, of course, you can always go to antiwar.com/radio later and find the link straight to it on the archive of this interview, which you'll want to pass around to all your friends anyway, I bet. Welcome to the show, Josh. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us. Now, I think Angela, my producer, mentioned that, I'm not sure if she was sure, but she mentioned that she thought that you were actually a conscientious objector, what they call an Israeli refusenik. Is that right?
In a sense, I was born in the United States. My father was born in Israel, and because of that, I received automatic Israeli citizenship upon my birth in this country. And as an act of protest, I did burn the Israeli military deferment papers that I had in my possession.
I see. So that's something.
It's something. Yeah.
Well, hey, I'm glad that, they didn't try to really draft you. Maybe there'll come a time where American citizens get drafted by the IDF, all right, so you know what? I actually was explaining to the audience on the show yesterday that the reason I'm not covering these Israeli-Palestinian peace talks is because, yeah, right, let me know when they start tearing the wall down and moving the settlers out. Otherwise, this is all the same nonsense. It's pretended peace talks my whole life. I don't even care to cover it. But then the reason that I thought it'd be a good idea to interview you about it is because apparently you're looking at it the same way I am. Your piece here at the Huffington Post is called Top 10 Reasons for Skepticism on Israeli-Palestinian Talks. Not too impressed, huh?
No, not at all. And, you really have to question the Obama administration's timing in wanting to resume these negotiations right now, when the Israeli government is continuing its colonization efforts of Palestinian land and committing human rights abuses against Palestinians on a daily basis. I mean, just a few weeks ago, there was a leaked video from 2001 of current Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu bragging back in 2001 about how he stopped the former peace process back in the 1990s. So it's really absurd, I think, for Palestinians to be arm-twisted to the negotiating table when they have to sit across the table from an Israeli prime minister who bragged about stopping the last peace process. It's just completely nonsensical.
Yeah, well, this is also an Israeli prime minister who commissioned the Clean Break study by Wormser and Pearl that said this is how to completely remake the Middle East, is we'll trash Oslo, we'll get America to get rid of Saddam Hussein for us, and we'll remake the Middle East, and Israel will be so much more powerful than all their neighbors from then on that no one will ever mess with us again. And he's also the same guy who at least once bragged that September 11th was great for Israel.
Yeah, and to make matters worse, on top of that, Israel's current foreign minister is himself a settler living in an illegal Israeli colony on expropriated Palestinian land who has often called for the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So you put these two at the head of the negotiating team, and you've got to wonder what President Obama is thinking in terms of the prospects for peace coming out of these talks.
Well, and, if it was Obama or anybody else, I wonder whether the United States empire, the American empire, has the ability to, what would obviously be necessary in this case would be to dictate terms to the Israelis that this is what you have to do now or no more welfare for you. That's it. We're cutting you off unless you get out of the West Bank. George Bush couldn't do that with a 90% approval rating.
And that's exactly what we've been arguing for the Obama administration and before that the Bush administration to do, is to use the leverage that the United States has over Israel to induce it and to force it to comply with international law, human rights standards, and UN resolutions. And if you look back in history, there's this kind of mistaken notion that Israel can only be coddled into doing the right thing. But if you look back at the history of U.S. presidents, the exact opposite is true. And I'm thinking specifically of the actions that President Eisenhower took after Israel invaded and conquered territory from Egypt in 1956. He cut off all forms of U.S. assistance to Israel because Israel refused to abide by UN Security Council resolutions saying that it should withdraw. And Israel was only able to keep up its intransigence for a few months before it withdrew to the international borders because of that U.S. pressure. And if Obama were to do the same thing today, to cut off the anticipated $30 billion of weapons that are going to flow from the U.S. to Israel over the next decade, Israel would be coming to the table singing a much different tune.
Well, there was a story not too long ago also about Ronald Reagan calling, I guess it was Menachem Begin, during air raids on Beirut. And he said, stop this. This is a Holocaust. And I'm sorry if I have the prime minister wrong here, but the Israeli prime minister said, no, you don't tell me about what a Holocaust is or whatever. And Reagan said, well, fine, but still stop the bombing now. And they stopped in like 3 minutes. The bombing raids were over. And then Reagan said to whoever wrote this in his biography or whatever, maybe it was Donald Reagan or something, that, wow, I didn't know I could do that. If I just tell the Israelis what to do, they actually do it. If I actually make it a declarative statement like that, huh?
Yeah, and it points to the underlying fact that Israel is incredibly dependent upon the United States, especially when it comes to weapons. And the fact that the United States has this huge amount of leverage over Israel and fails to use it is part of this ongoing pattern of failed negotiations that we've seen in the past.
Well, okay, so what about the question, because I want to get into a lot of these substantive points that you make in your piece at the Huffington Post here, Josh, but first I wanted to ask you whether, just in the broader sense, if it isn't too late for this, that, you look at a map of the West Bank, the amount of change, like just in quantity, that would have to take place in order for there to be anything like a legitimate so-called state there, seems to me quite a few bridges too far. How many settlers live there? Hundreds of thousands? And then would the IDF force them out, even if Netanyahu issued the order?
That's a great question. There are now over 500,000 Israeli settlers in the Palestinian West Bank and East Jerusalem. And if you look at some of the major settlements in the West Bank, some of the major settlement blocks like Gush Etzion, like Ariel, they look more like very well-established metropolitan cities than they do some tiny outpost on top of a hill. It's very, very difficult to envision how these very permanent pieces of infrastructure that Israel's created on occupied Palestinian territory will ever be dismantled. And without them being dismantled, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to see how a viable and contiguous Palestinian state could be composed of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. So that does leave open the question, has Israel's policies led to a point where the only feasible solution is some form of a binational or one-state solution where the territory of historic Palestine, what's now Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, is not divided, and that Israelis and Palestinians live together on some kind of an equal footing as citizens of the same political structure. I think Israel is definitely putting in place the policies that will make that latter option the only viable one.
Right, and then there will be mass deaths because especially the radical right in Israel, they're not going to tolerate Israel losing its Jewish majority character and control, and a minority outright apartheid system can't last that long. And, these are the words of Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. As we go out to this break here, I'll let you comment when we get back. Sorry about that. And heartbreak's built in here. Everybody, it's Josh